Alright, we've got a Polaris RZR Turbo S here, and we're going to install our spring kit. First thing you want to do is, you can do it with the shocks on the car. If you don't have a jack like we do where you can lift the whole car off the ground, you can just do the front and then do the rear with just a regular car jack in your driveway. But take the tires off, remove your lower shock bolt first, and then you're going to go to adjusting and taking your preload all the way off so that you can get the springs actually off the shock. So we've already got the tires off. We're going to pull this lower shock mount off and then slide the bump stop up. So shock bolt and then bump stop, and then we'll go to there. Okay, because you're going to need to get this lower retainer off, the bump stop's going to be in your way, so just using a flat blade screwdriver, you can shove it in the hole and push the bump stop up about 2 inches or so. Okay, now that you got your shock bolt undone and your bump stop out of the way, you need to turn the preload all the way up. So on this Turbo S, there's no, it's not a double nut, it's just a single nut. So you just have to grab onto the spring and the nut and twist it all the way up until, well, within a half inch of the top up here, and then you should be able to pull the retainer out. So once you get that preload turned off a little bit, sometimes you can get a screwdriver in here. I sprayed a little bit of WD-40 or Tri-Flow on the threads. You can put a screwdriver in the eyelet and just kind of spin the whole eyelet, and it'll spin the preload nut. It's a little bit easier than trying to reach your hand up in there, and there's a lot of sharp things, so this is kind of a little trick that just makes it a little bit easier. Alright, so we got the preload all the way off so that you've got about a half inch of slop in here, and then you're able to pull that retainer out the bottom, and you'll reuse this. So set that to the side and then take off your tender and main. You'll also reuse your divider, so you can set the stock springs to the side, and we'll go back together. Okay, now that you got everything off the shock, you do have to install the supplied crossover nut in the kit. I'll use a little small Allen to take these. I take these all the way out and spread the nut a little bit so that it leaves a gap that's about the size of the screw, and that'll allow it to spin on easily. And then you're going to spin this up to where the instructions tell you to set it at, and then just tighten it back down with your Allen wrench. You don't need to go super tight. I just use the short side of the Allen and go snug on both of them. There's no need to go any tighter than that. So put your crossover nut on and set it to the height that the instructions say. Okay, so we've threaded the crossover up really close to our measurement, and you're going to measure from where the body cap screws onto the body, the very bottom lip of that, down to the top of the crossover, approximately 6 inches. This will give you a good starting point. And again, once you get it to that 6 inches, then you can just snug this up with your Allen wrench. You don't have to go crazy tight or anything like that. I just use the short side and go snug with what you can do with your finger, and you're good to go. And then you set your preload next. So we're going to get the springs and slide those on, and then show you how to set the preload length. Okay, so you're going to put your tender on first. Generally, there's no direction, but I generally put the progressive or the tighter coil side to the top, and then your spring divider. The long lip's going to stay facing your main just the way it came off. Slide that on, and it's going to touch your crossover right now because this has an internal bump stock spring in it. So then you slide your main on, and I usually hook back up my shock bolt so then you can push down on the wheel and extend the shock. It'll make it a little bit easier to put this back in. You don't have to muscle it quite so much. So we'll hook back up the shock bolt and then push down on the wheel and slide this in. Okay, so now that I got my bolt in, you can push down on the wheel and it'll kind of extend it for you so that you can push the retainer in. So you can see it's kind of has an internal spring in here in the body that doesn't allow it to go all the way out. So by hooking it up, you can get the shock to extend all the way. It makes it easier to put that retainer in. And then the next step, the final step, is just to set your preload at 4 inches. So you're gonna have to spin it down, and the same measurement, you're gonna go from the top right here where the body cap screws onto the top of the nut, and you're going to set it right at 4 inches, and then tighten up your lower shock bolt, put your wheel and tire back on, and you're done. Okay, so we've set our preload nut roughly at 4 inches and our crossover nut around 6 inches. So those are your two starting points on your preload and your crossover. Again, you can go stiffer on your preload if you want a higher ride height. This is where we recommend you start at so that you don't get the car too high. The crossover point should have roughly 1 inch of travel between the divider and the nut. So just remember to tighten your shock bolt and any other bolts that you loosen before you wrap up, and you're finished. Okay, the last thing that you'll see in the instructions, we recommend that you remove your front sway bar when you're running our spring kit on the XP1000s as well as this Turbo S. Because of the rate of progression that we have built into the spring package, there's no need to run the front sway bar. It's going to give you a lot plusher ride, especially if you're doing a lot of rock crawling or like King of Hammerish type, you know, desert and rock crawling as well as dunes. So you're going to need to remove your link rod here from the bar and from the A-arm, and then you'll have to undo these 2 bolts right here, and that'll release your sway bar from the frame. Just hang on to your bushings that are in there and keep your sway bar that way if you decide you want to go back to it to make it really stiff and stable for maybe short course. Other than that, 90% of all the other type of riding, we're going to recommend that you remove that sway bar. Okay, we're moving on to the rear now. So we've still got it on our lift, so we've got the tire off and out of the way. That helps so that you have easier access to everything. First thing we got to do is back the preload off. So I like to pull the intake tube kind of out of the way because it kind of gets in your way when you're trying to grab this spring and preload nut. You're going to back the preload all the way off until it's loose, and it'll take a minute. This is probably the hardest part of the kit, is getting the rear preload off, and it depends on if you've already jacked a bunch of preload into it, trying to get your ride height up. So back the preload off first. All right, so we got the preload nice and loose, so we've got to get this lower retainer off. Again, just like the fronts, you're going to want to use a screwdriver to pry the bump stop up out of the way 1 inch or 2. Large flat blade screwdriver works the best. And then when you have the preload loose, you can pull the retainer off like that. Slide your main and tender spring off. Again, just like the front, you're going to reuse the spring divider, so clean that up. Sometimes there's dirt and grime on it, so clean it up good, and we're going to reuse that. So once you get that off, set that to the side and grab your crossover nut. Again, I've spread this a little bit, and the 2 little screws are loose on there. We're going to slide this up on. If your shock is really dirty, make sure you clean it before. This shock's pretty clean. It's been washed before, so this will screw on nicely. And then you're going to refer to your instructions as to how far up you need to screw the crossover nut. All right, so we've got the preload all the way up, and we've spun the crossover nut up to the setting. If you look on the instructions, it'll give you a starting point. It's roughly 7 inches if you're measuring from the body cap down. That's a good starting point. The crossover is really handy because you can utilize it to adjust your bottoming resistance without affecting your ride height. So that's why an adjustable crossover nut inside your tender spring is so important. That's included in the kit. Again, when you tighten up these little set screws, just do it finger tight with a little Allen wrench. You don't need to go crazy on those. Just make sure you're right around that 7 inches from the cap down, and then we can slide the tender spring, the divider, and the main spring on and put the lower retainer on. So we'll do that next. Okay, so your tender spring is going to go on first. That's not directional, neither is your main spring, but this divider is. It's just the way it came off. You want the short lip going up towards the crossover nut, the long lip facing down towards your main spring. And then your main spring, slide that on. And don't quite have enough preload off, so we'll back this off a little bit more. We'll make it a little bit easier to put the retainer on the bottom. Once you get that up high enough, you'll be able to slide this back in the way it came off. So I'm going to go ahead and back some more preload off, and then we'll clip this in and show you how to button it up and set your preload. Okay, so we got the lower retainer back on, and we've set the preload. Again, refer to your instructions. It's roughly 2 1/4 inches from the body cap edge to the top of the preload nut. That's a good starting point, depending on how much weight you're carrying. If you've got a rear box, spare tire, different things like that, you're going to need to add preload to compensate for how much extra weight you have in the car. With that, you will adjust your crossover nut, again, to tune bottoming resistance for big G outs and stuff like that. But the preload is your main adjustment that you need to set up in the beginning to make sure that the car is fairly level. So when the car's on the ground and you've driven it around and it's settled into its correct ride height, that's when you want to check your ride height and make sure that the car's sitting level. You can kind of see it with just if you have it parked on a level surface and you measure under the frame with a measuring tape, or just kind of eye it up. And then just go out there and have fun and play with your preload to get that ride height and your crossover for your bottoming resistance. And give us a call or look us up on zbrozracing.com if you have questions.